So I'm wondering if you've had the experience of observing a conversation or some kind of a public discourse around a particular issue, and from your more detached and objective place, you're able to see the bigger picture and understand where everyone's coming from. However, everyone is debating their ideas against the other, and maybe certain distinctions are being made, and perhaps certain dots are getting connected while other dots are getting neglected. And I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about. And these are some of the interesting dynamics that play out when we come together to share our perspectives around issues, big and small. So, what I want to talk about in this video, obviously there's a lot going on in these conversations, so we're not going to get into all of it, but this is following up from a previous video where we were talking about really starting these conversations at a more foundational level, because we're not just negotiating diverse perspectives, we're also negotiating how we are each connected to and relating to whatever the realities are. So we looked at three, I'm calling them reality archetypes just for fun. They're not really meant to describe one person. They're just meant for us to understand certain archetypes and certain ways that we relate to our reality that can have us drawn to certain sources and sharing certain perspectives and participating in certain dynamics in conversations. So this is meant to be nuanced, but I want to start from this place and just look at some of the dynamics that play out with what we're calling these different levels of view. So my name is Sheila, and the overall purpose of this channel is for us to orient ourselves within the big picture. And we're doing this with a framework that I've been developing and exploring. I say that, and I will always say that, because I feel that any kind of a system or framework needs to be flexible, and it needs to be something that can move and change and grow with us. We'll talk about that another time, but this is a framework that can help us orient our perspectives within the big picture so that we can navigate these conversations a little easier, so that some of these things don't play out as much, and also so that we can bring together the big picture of these issues and things that we face, so that when it comes time for us to solve problems and, bring solutions to things and come to some kind of an agreement on what we're going to do, it's easier because we see the big picture. So I hope that was clear. If it wasn't, don't worry, just keep listening. You don't have to have watched the previous video to follow what we're going to talk about here. You can always go back to it if you want more context, but it's really super simple. So this is just one variable of many that are in the mix, but this is probably one of the most profound, although very simple, variables. And it's probably the best one for us to start with, because it really gets to the foundation of where our perspectives are coming from. And so just being aware of this goes a long way. So before I share about these three different levels of view, I want you to promise that you're not going to instantly dismiss this because of how simple and obvious it seems. Sometimes it's actually the simplest and the most obvious things that are the hardest for us to see. And we're going to be talking more about all the dynamics that play out with this. And so I think by the end of the video, you'll have a better sense of just the effect that this has and just how valuable it is to be aware of. So simply put, when we're connecting to our experience or sharing our perspectives, we are connecting to one or more of these three different levels of view. So we're either connecting to the higher perspective on the issue or experience, or we're connecting to the realities of that issue or experience, or we're looking below the surface or behind the scenes and connecting to the deeper understandings of that issue. Now, of course, we're all connecting to these different levels at different times, depending on different circumstances, depending on the topic, depending on who we're talking to. There's a variety of reasons why we might hang out at certain levels. Although I would say that most of us are predisposed to hang out in one of these places more than others. And this is why we were looking at those different archetypes. But so this isn't about us having to be always connected to all three and always seeing the big picture. That I don't think is very realistic. As we're making sense of our experience, we're kind of going up and down the scale, looking at things from different angles. And so this is a really good thing to be aware of as we're taking in information and making sense of things for ourselves, because it can be insightful to know kind of where you're connecting when you're taking things in and what types of information you seem to be drawn to and all of that. And it can be especially valuable when we come together to share our perspectives, because when you start to see the dynamics that normally play out with this, just the awareness of where our perspectives are coming from and having the language to be able to speak to it can really, really help. So what I want to do is walk through a typical conversation, and I want to use the example of crime because I think that's a topic we can probably all relate to on some level, and it's a really easy one for looking at this particular variable. And so none of these are necessarily my perspectives. I'm just sharing some of the typical perspectives that you might hear from the different levels of view, and then we're going to look at all the dynamics that play out with that. All right, let's get into that. So when it comes to the topic of crime, those that are more connected to the realities of crime, these may be people that work in the justice system or law enforcement, or who have been victims of crime, or who may be witnessing crime in their neighborhood. So these people are very in touch and up close with the realities of crime. And because of this, they're more likely to share perspectives around cracking down on crime. They may be asking for bail reform because they've noticed that people out on bail are offending. And so they may get really frustrated with those that come along with higher perspectives that may seem out of touch with the realities that they're seeing. Or they could also get frustrated with those that are bringing in some of the deeper complexities and deeper understandings around prevention and reform and, awareness around the ways maybe different groups of people are being treated differently by the justice system and things like that, because those things may bring in complexities that may interfere with the ability for them to a deal with those more urgent matters. And so they're thinking a lot more practically and more urgently. So those that are connected more to the deeper understandings of crime, these may be people who work with, people with mental illness and addiction. They perhaps are psychologists or people who have worked in the system and who are a little bit more aware of some of the behind the scenes types of things going on. And so they're really more interested in dealing with things at the root and addressing things at more of a foundational level. They're more in touch with why people do what they do. And so they may be bringing in some of those more empathetic and compassionate perspectives, which to those that are more connected to those realities might seem a little soft and not realistic or not really addressing those urgent matters. So I'm sure you've noticed the different dynamics that play out and arguments that happen between these different levels of view. And I'm sure you can appreciate the value of the reality perspective as well as the value of those deeper understandings, and also how these things can actually go together, although they may, especially when we're looking at it up close, appear to be at odds. So certain things might appear to be at odds. And I would say that when we find those sticking points, those are probably the most valuable places for us to explore, because by understanding what seems to be opposing perspectives, it can be very valuable to see how those things could go together, because very often things that are opposing have a certain interrelationship, and sometimes it's paradoxical. Anyway, that's something we can talk about in another video, how, looking at these things that appear to go against each other. But the more we also have the bigger picture, the easier it can be for us to see those things and to make the distinctions that we need to make, and to be able to start to bring together these different levels of view and to value these different places. So those that are connected more to a higher perspective on crime, this could be some kind of a religious or spiritual belief that may have them relating to the realities of crime based on that belief system. And this can be very different depending on the person. So you can have two people connected to a very similar higher belief, but how they negotiate that with reality can be very, very different. So, for example, you might have someone who believes in karma, and they may relate to crime in a way of thinking, well, everything is just working itself out. Maybe this person did something in a past life and they've attracted that, and, all of that. So they may have a little bit more of a detached perspective around that. But not everybody who believes in karma will have that particular relationship with the reality of crime. This could even just be somebody who is looking at the statistics on crime and who's noticing that the crime rates have actually gone down. So they may be bringing that perspective to the conversation, which is a valuable perspective, but it also may seem a little detached to those that are upfront with the realities. And, somebody who's very in touch with the realities of those things might say, okay, well, great that these statistics are down, but does that mean that we still don't address the crime that's still happening, right? So these are really interesting dynamics. And, to those that are connected to those deeper understandings and those realities, the higher perspectives can sometimes feel a little too detached or a little bit out of touch, but some of those perspectives are extremely valuable to understanding the issue. And I would also say, depending on the quality of the higher perspective, sometimes having that detached viewpoint and seeing things from a more elevated perspective can give us the perspective that we need to be able to address realities without being as reactive and enmeshed in things. And when it comes to these higher perspectives, this is also where people might relate to it from, doing things that they feel can affect these realities from a higher level. So that could be prayer or just, where they put their focus and attention. So you might have those that believe that what you focus on, you create your reality based on what you focus on. So those people might actually be interested in not focusing too much on those negative things. They may be more interested in disengaging from news and things like that has them in fear and all of those things. So again, as you can see, there can be a bit of a clash between these levels of view. But one thing I will say for myself is that I've noticed that depending on the topic being discussed, I will connect to things on different levels. So if the conversation for me is connected to the school system and kids, because I have a lot of firsthand experience with that, then I am way more likely to share a reality perspective and sometimes even a deeper understanding perspective around that. And when the topic is something where maybe I've done a lot of reading about it, so I've connected to some higher concepts on that, so I might be bringing more of a higher perspective on whatever that is. And so by realizing that for myself, that where I land changes depending on the topic, and that actually makes a lot of sense, that we're going to be connected to different issues differently based on our experiences. And so by being aware of that, I can understand what that's like when you're really seeing something up close and other people are out of touch or they're overcomplicating things, and how frustrating that can be. But on the flip side, I'm also aware that I'm sometimes the person that's bringing in that higher perspective, or other way around. Sometimes when you're connected to the higher perspective, you can feel like people just aren't able to connect to whatever higher level you're connected to, and that can be frustrating as well. So just by bringing our awareness to this, it's really simple. When we're sharing our perspectives, we can speak to the level of view that we're speaking to, or speak to the level of view that someone else is sharing. So you might say, well, I'm bringing a more of a reality perspective to this because I've had a lot of experience with this, and these are the realities that I'm seeing, but I can appreciate that you're bringing a higher perspective, or I understand that you're connected to some of the deeper understandings. And from there, once we see that, it becomes easier to look at how those things can go together. So another thing I want to mention about this is how certain concepts, and so connected to the topic of crime, a good example of this is the concept of victim, can be understood very differently on these different levels. And it can be extremely dangerous when we misapply a higher concept or a deeper understanding concept to reality in a way that can be really harmful. So the concept of victim is a really good example of that. So when we look at some of the higher perspectives around victim, I'm sure you've heard people talk about things like victim consciousness. I won't get into it because I think this is something we could do another video on if you're interested. But so we, have, or even concepts of forgiveness and things like that. And I'm not saying anything against that, but when we bring that down into realities and we start applying these higher concepts to reality without properly making some really important distinctions, this can be really problematic. Similarly, when we're exploring some of the deeper understandings, again, this might have us approaching victim realities differently when we're bringing in deeper concepts. And so anyway, that's another conversation, but that's another reason why it's so valuable for us to be aware of these different levels of view. Sometimes I just wish we had different words, completely different words for things, because then it would be less likely to conflate these things. And there's many examples of this. So anyway, that is another conversation. I will leave it here. I hope this was valuable. I would love to hear any feedback you have, anything you've noticed in your own experience, and whatever you share will help to inform future videos. And of course, I would also appreciate any support you can give to help get this out there, because as we speak, this is a very new channel, so it's especially hard to get engagement early on. So whatever you can do to help would be very appreciated. And so I hope you stay in touch, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.